Dr. Fitzgerald and I have today signed a serious and solemn agreement which signifies the way ahead in relations between our two countries.
Well, I think the two things that Margaret Thatcher possibly regretted looking back over her time were the Anglo-Irish Agreement and the need to surrender sovereignty over Hong Kong back to China.
The Irish Republic will be able to put forward views and proposals in the conference on stated aspects of Northern Ireland affairs.
And if Mary, Queen of Scots, went to her grave with Calais engraved on her heart, maybe Margaret Thatcher went to hers with the Anglo-Irish Agreement and Hong Kong on her heart.
Against all her political instincts, on the morning of November the 15th, 1985, Margaret Thatcher flew into Hillsborough Castle to sign an agreement she'd been told would help to bring an end to the conflict in Northern Ireland. Her closest friend at Westminster had just resigned in protest, and furious unionists were already gathering at the gates.
It had gone so far by then that there was no going back on it.
For 2 years, Robert Armstrong was Margaret Thatcher's lead negotiator and the chief architect of the Anglo-Irish Agreement. Despite several setbacks, including an IRA attempt to kill her, he'd kept the process on track and ensured unionists were excluded.
It was a deliberate, massive betrayal of the unionists by Margaret Thatcher.
We were dreadfully angry to the point that we almost lost faith in the democratic process.
Why did Margaret Thatcher deliberately keep unionists in the dark on the Anglo-Irish Agreement? Why did she betray them and, behind their backs, talk to the very terrorists she'd sworn to defeat?
It was very much sort of back-channel discussion, but nothing disreputable about that.
During 11 years in power, Margaret Thatcher polarised and inspired in equal measure, not only in Britain, but around the world. She helped end the Cold War and won victory in the Falklands, but she'll forever be associated with the violence of the miners' strike and the poll tax riots.
Margaret Thatcher didn't just lead our country, she saved our country.
In Northern Ireland, it's her role in the conflict that defines her legacy. Despite landslide election victories and an historic agreement with Dublin, she failed to bring an end to the violence.
She was, I think, far more interested in her world position, dealing with Ronald Reagan and dealing with the bigger issues of the day, as opposed to dealing with Northern Ireland, which I suspect she considered to be a security problem. And if it was contained, well, then she wasn't going to lose too much sleep over the Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland fighting with one another.
We shall give the strongest possible support to the security forces in combating terrorism, and there will be no amnesty for convicted terrorists.
The long road to Hillsborough began during Margaret Thatcher's rise to power a decade earlier, when she defeated Ted Heath for the leadership of the Conservative Party. The MP who helped organise her campaign was also her spokesman in Northern Ireland and the prism through which she viewed the Troubles.
Heath had to go, and we had to have a new leader. And it was then Airy Neve who came to me and said, look, the one that could do it is Margaret. So I joined Airy Neve's team to win the election for her to become leader of the party.
She came over here, conducted by Airy Neve, and I wasn't hugely impressed by her, oddly enough, at that time. I thought, rather mousy looking.
We do want to see the government show determination to defeat terrorism. We don't want any more dealings with terrorists, and we do want the security forces to have adequate powers, especially legal powers, to get on top of the leaders of the terrorists.
Airy took the view that there had to be a military solution to the problem before there could be a political solution. In his own words to me, an army that's winning needs no recruiting sergeant.
Margaret Thatcher and Airy Neave came from a generation of politicians shaped by the events of World War II and its aftermath. Airy Neave had escaped from Colditz, while as a teenager, Margaret Thatcher had seen her hometown in the northeast of England bombed by the Germans. The war and the events that led up to it would later shape her political outlook and thinking on Northern Ireland.
One of the sort of analogies that she kept quite frequently mentioned was the Sudetenland. When Czechoslovakia was carved out of the Treaty of Versailles, a very large and industrially prosperous chunk of it was the Sudetenland. And she brought Garrett up short on one occasion when he was he was saying, well, you know, the nationalist community, they're a permanent minority, they have no access to power because they're in the first past the post system, and so on and so forth. And she said, I see, it's like the Sudetenland, which certainly halted Garrett stopped him in his tracks.
She mentioned the Sudeten Germans, where you've a group of people from a certain tribe find themselves as a minority in a country where another larger tribe is dominant. And her attitude to that was, well, tough luck. That's, you know, what do you expect me to do?
Margaret Thatcher tended to think of the Republic's claim on Northern Ireland rather as Hitler's claim on the Sudetenland, because you had the same situation, mutatis mutandis. I think that's actually quite revealing. I think that analogy was in her mind.
The conflict in Northern Ireland reached Margaret Thatcher personally just weeks before she became Prime Minister, when Airy Neave was murdered in a Republican bomb attack at the House of Commons. Not only had she lost a close friend and confidant, but her chief advisor on Northern Ireland.
Just now, 7 minutes ago, I was told. We don't know yet. Terrible news, Mrs. Thatcher.
She lost her right-hand man, as it were, before she started to terrorism. I don't think she had any doubts about how to carry on, and that was, we will not allow terrorism to subvert democracy.
His murder helped to give Margaret this and almost antipathy to the Republic and to the Irish.
Some devils got him. And they must never, never, never be allowed to triumph. They must never prevail.
Airy Neave had viewed Northern Ireland as an integral part of the United Kingdom and believed that the conflict had to be won militarily. After his death, Airy Neave's opinions became Margaret Thatcher's policies.
I come to see the troops here, and I come to see the people and hear what they have to say to me.
I don't think she really had any affection for the place at all, or any particular interest in it. It was, an irritating security problem and to be dealt with in that way. She was happier talking to soldiers.
Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister in 1979. Despite having been in Parliament for 20 years, she'd failed to create a single relationship with the leaders of unionism.
She was a unionist in principle, but she found discussing Irish matters with the unionists uphill work, and they didn't have the same mindset, and we all knew that.
How did she view leaders like Ian Paisley and Jim Molyneux at that time?
Well, I suppose they were sent to trials, weren't they? But
she had a great affection for some, I mean, Ken McGuinness in particular. She had a great respect and admiration for, and his difficult position down there in Fermanagh.
She sat down at the communal table on one evening and said, "Oh yes, I've heard of you, you served with the UDR." And from that, we were really quite good friends. We got on very well. And she would call me, the only person besides my mother who would do so, would call me Kenneth. And Kenneth, could I see you about this?
Unionists knew that Margaret Thatcher could patronise them. But the IRA forced the conflict onto her agenda just weeks after she became Prime Minister, killing Lord Mountbatten and 18 soldiers in separate attacks in August 1979.
Oh, the death of Lord Mountbatten made her see the Northern Ireland problem basically in security terms. This was a problem of trying to bring security to the province, to try to deal with terrorism. It was a problem for the military to be involved in dealing with, as well as the police. It conditioned her whole outlook.
The Mountbatten murder caused Margaret Thatcher to review her military strategy in Northern Ireland. It would be the first of many such reviews during her time in power. Irish Premier Jack Lynch travelled to London for Lord Mountbatten's funeral and later to meet Margaret Thatcher in Downing Street, where she demanded greater security cooperation from him and his government. Downing Street minutes of the meeting highlight her priorities.
Maggie entered the room, I recall it fairly vividly. They're dressed in black, mourning black from head to toe. We had already received intimations from the British that they were going to have a shopping list of what they wished for new security cooperation measures. Most notably, I suppose, in respect of later events that came out, the question of helicopter overflights into a certain distance into the Republic. And of course, we already had going on for a number of years the arguments about extradition. So it was quite a contentious meeting, I think it's fair to say.
Somebody made the suggestion that, you know, Prime Minister, there may be a certain amount of sympathy with what the IRA are at, with their aims, not necessarily with their methods, with their aims. She became furious. She jumped up from her chair, she thumped the table and was almost about to leap over the table. "Are you condoning murder? And, you know, if this is the way you're going to, if this is your attitude, we finish." And Jack Lynch kind of put his hand out and said, "Look, Prime Minister, we both have the same objective. Don't continue with this sort of attitude." So she quietened down.
Jack Lynch was utterly and totally useless, as wet as a whistle, would never do anything. I mean, the man was a prisoner. Well, he seemed to be. She concluded there was nothing doing at a very early meeting with him. There never was.
Thatcher's instinctive reaction to the violence had been to demand that Dublin introduce new security measures, but it had failed and only contributed to the political pressure on Jack Lynch, who resigned weeks later. Now Thatcher had a new partner in Dublin, Charles J. Haughey.
But I would have to say, yes, there was a sort of glint in his eye, which she found actually quite attractive.
He set out to charm her, and I suppose at the beginning she was slightly susceptible to the charm, and relations developed reasonably well.
She said to me that we had all been making a great mistake about Charles Hockey, that he was a romantic idealist. And that wasn't entirely consistent with the view which I had learnt to have of Charlie Hockey.
Charles Hockey flirted with Thatcher but had no interest in giving in to her demands for greater security cooperation. He wanted an international conference convened to bring all parties to the negotiating table. But by the time they met in Dublin in December 1980, the political romance was all but over. IRA inmates at the Longkesh prison had begun a hunger strike in protest at conditions, and as the summit got underway, 2 hunger strikers were close to death.
Some of the older prisoners wanted to bring the issue to a head, wanted to bring it to the point where there could be talking and where there could be a resolution, and that almost happened, but didn't.
I genuinely believe that the reason Thatcher came with a very high-ranking delegation, it was Carrington, Howe, so on, to Dublin Castle in 1980, and during that summit the hunger strike was still on, was to try and defuse that situation. So I think that the first hunger strike contributed to pushing her into the direction of agreeing what was called at the time an Anglo-Irish framework.
We were all concerned about the hunger strikers and about the possible consequences, not just, in Northern Ireland itself and in Ireland, but in the United States and internationally.
Still very deeply concerned and anxious about the H-Block situation, and I have made that clear to the British Prime Minister and to the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, that if there's any possible way in which the Irish government can assist in bringing forward a solution, we stand ready to do so.
The first hunger strike broke down in confusion. For a time, it was thought that Margaret Thatcher's government had given in to the prisoners' demands, but she hadn't.
I think the tragedy was it could all have been settled, I think, after the first hunger strike.
We will not compromise on this. There will be no political status.
No, these are just awful situations, you know, in which there's sort of no right answer.
In March 1981, a second hunger strike began, which led to the death of Bobby Sands and 9 other Republican prisoners. During the 7-month-long dispute, almost 70 people were murdered.
Men of violence have chosen in recent months to play what may well be their last card. They've turned their violence against themselves through the prison hunger strike to death.
It was the IRA High Command which killed those men, not Margaret Thatcher. They weren't starved to death by her, they were starved to death by their High Command.
I think we got ourselves into, the government got itself into a position where once the hunger strike had started, it was very difficult for them to find a way out. And so they just had to let it take its course. I wouldn't like to comment on whether or not there were ways in which the hunger strike could have been avoided, but the way the policy was being pursued at that time, the hunger strike was inevitable, and the difficulties of getting rid of the hunger strike followed naturally from that. Once she was set upon a course, she was not easily shaken off it.
In public, Margaret Thatcher was dogmatic, yet secretly she negotiated. Her own handwriting could be seen on a message that was sent directly to the prisoners.
Was she aware that it could be resolved? Yes, I would say yes. Clearly, she would have known, and if she didn't, she should have, that the hunger strike could have been ended without anyone dying, and she decided that wasn't going to be the case.
The hunger strike was the first time she'd negotiated with the Republican leadership. Later, she would use secret back channels to communicate again with Republicans, communications that would ultimately lead to the IRA ceasefire.
She was vilified in Republican folklore for being this unfeeling person who let people die. And it was quite clear that there was more going on in the background than the thing, and that Mrs. Thatcher too was prepared to deal with it. There were offers and compromises being floated around.
Sands, Bobby, anti-H block, Armagh, political prisoner, 30,492. West, Henry W., Ulster Unionist, 29,046. And I declare that Bobby Sands has been duly elected to serve as a member for the said constituency.
After the ending of the hunger strike, Margaret Thatcher conceded to the Republican prisoners' demands for better conditions. But, much to the concern of both the British and Irish governments, outside the prison, the IRA was now rejuvenated and Republicans were building a political base.
I think her impact in Ireland in that respect was second only to that of General Sir John Maxwell in 1916, in that it led to a huge surge of support for the Republican movement. But now, as it happens, that did translate into the growth of their political wing. But I mean, this is what one might call unintended consequences.
Thatcher was still sticking to Erin Neave's policy and attempting to defeat the IRA militarily, but it wasn't working. She used Northern Ireland as somewhere to banish her cabinet enemies to. As Secretary of State, Jim Pryor was sidelined in Northern Ireland and knew that Margaret Thatcher was relying on trusted friends for advice.
The problem for Margaret was that she had two people who had powerful intellects and were absolutely out-and-out unionists. One was Ian Gow, who was a very, very decent man. Very good man, Ian Gow, and very popular in the party, but he was an out-and-out, old-fashioned unionist. And the other man was Enoch Powell.
They must recognize that this province is part and parcel by as good a right as any other of the United Kingdom.
Enoch Powell obviously had very similar views to Margaret on quite a lot of issues, on the economy and so on. And because Northern Ireland was the only place where he could get a constituency, he became more unionist than any other unionist I ever met, I think. And they had a great influence on Margaret.
In the early 80s, her government was staggering from crisis to crisis. There were even Tories ready to challenge her leadership. Then, the Argentinians decided to invade the Falkland Islands.
The government has now decided that a large task force will sail as soon as all preparations are complete.
As she prepared for war, in Dublin, Charles Haughey saw an opportunity to stand up to Thatcher. In 1982, Ireland had a seat on the United Nations Security Council, and Haughey used it to try to bring international pressure on Britain.
I think she had begun to wonder before that, but that really confirmed her in the feeling that Haughey was not to be trusted and was not a friend of Britain.
The extraordinary, unnecessary and mad initiative of Mr. Haughey on the Falklands War ended any possibility of any dialogue of any sort.
The Battle of the Falklands was a remarkable military operation, boldly planned, bravely executed, and brilliantly accomplished.
Margaret Thatcher was now in an unassailable position in British politics, but Anglo-Irish relations had broken down. Then, over a late-night drink at a Downing Street dinner to toast her victory in the South Atlantic, she suggested for the first time that she was interested in seeking a political way forward for Northern Ireland.
I said to her, it seems to me a scandal that the only place in the world now where British lives are being lost in anger is actually in the United Kingdom, in Northern Ireland. And that got us launched on a discussion of Ireland.
Just listen to everyone. I must go down and
At the end of this conversation, she said reflectively, if we get back again, I think I'd like to do something about Ireland.
Come on, fight for a new man. We ask for a new man.
In June 1983, Margaret Thatcher was swept back into Downing Street. She would use her second term in office to take on the unions in Britain and challenge the unionists in Northern Ireland.
Mrs. Thatcher won a three-figure majority in the House of Commons in the wake of the Falklands victory. And in Dublin, Garret FitzGerald had succeeded Charles Haughey with a majority which suggested that he would be around for quite a reasonable period of time. She came out of that election with the feeling that this was unfinished business which she needed to tackle.
One of the worst days of terrorism London has seen. Mrs. Thatcher called the bombers callous and cowardly.
The force of the explosion was so great that parts of the car were flung across the park. So too were nails 4 and 6 inches long which had been packed around the bomb.
Democracy is the rejection of violence. And we're never, never going to be defeated by bombs and bullets.
After his election in 1982, Garret FitzGerald had written to Margaret Thatcher seeking to open talks on Northern Ireland. But still seething at the Irish behaviour during the Falklands dispute, Margaret Thatcher showed no interest in his invitation.
He was deeply worried about developments in Northern Ireland, particularly about, the term we used a lot at the time was the alienation of the minority, particularly following the hunger strikes, a belief that there was no hope in politics and that violence apparently was the only way forward.
She didn't like the word alienation, I don't know, perhaps because she thought it was Marxist. So, and of course she never lived in Ireland or Northern Ireland, so she didn't really, I don't think she fully grasped why the nationalists were as resentful as they were.
This morning, a British soldier was killed in Ballymurphy. The responsibility for that soldier's death lies with the British government. The tragedy of Ireland rests with the London government.
The 1983 election had also seen Sinn Féin leader Gerry Adams elected in West Belfast, consolidating Republicans' move into constitutional politics.
The buzzword was alienation. That was the buzzword. And what that meant was the growth in support for Sinn Féin. So that's what that was. It was nothing more or less than that. It was exclusive. It wasn't inclusive.
The Sinn Féin today, I mean, effectively dates, I mean, their year zero is the hunger strikes, and I mean, their political development, I mean, dates from that point.
I was certainly very conscious, and I think the same would have been true of Margaret Thatcher, that that Garret FitzGerald was as keen as we could be to try to prevent a revival or resurgence of IRA, of Sinn Féin power in the Irish government, in the Irish political system.
All right, now we're going to it again inside.
The problem was that at that moment, there was no dialogue with London. There was no negotiation. There wasn't even chit-chat.
With this new political threat from Sinn Féin, coupled with a resurgent IRA, Garret FitzGerald changed tactics with Margaret Thatcher and instead appealed to her only real interest in Northern Ireland, security. The Taoiseach decided that Michael Lillis should approach his London counterpart while he was in Dublin for a meeting.
Michael, whom I had never met before, or indeed never heard of before, said, would I come for a walk with him along the canal?
What I suggested was that we should try working together in the interest of security, right? Not for an Irish political agenda, but in the interest of improving the security and stability on the ground.
Initially, the idea was to find some kind of agreement on matters of security. Her concern about Northern Ireland was about the loss of life and the injuries, which she took very seriously, both among the soldiers and the other security forces, the RUC, and among ordinary people. And she took very seriously the cost of supporting the Northern Irish economy.
So that's how the thing began.
Margaret Thatcher agreed to open talks, but made a strategic decision not to involve the Northern Ireland office. Instead, she gave the job to David Goodall and his boss, Robert Armstrong, who, as her chief security advisors, had access to the intelligence coming from Northern Ireland, including that from agents inside the IRA.
We were very conscious of the fact that they both were at the absolute heart of the whole British power system, including security and intelligence. One of them, at one stage, told us that the communications codes that we had at that time were, I think the phrase was used, were easy to penetrate. In other words, they were able to read our messages.
Stick to your guns, Maggie. You're a good girl. Yeah, thank you. Can we let this?
Following her public handling of the hunger strikes, Margaret Thatcher's own security was an issue. She was now the IRA's #1 target.
I remember her saying, they'll probably get me in the end, but I don't like to hand myself to them on a plate.
During the Conservative Party conference in October 1984, the IRA's hatred for Margaret Thatcher exploded under a bath at the Grand Hotel Brighton, killing 5 people and injuring 31.
I was peaceably abed when we heard the sound of the explosion, and then the room began to collapse about us, and then it was quite a long time waiting to be dug out.
The bomb went off somewhere between 2:45 and 3. I know that because I looked up when I'd finished something at 2:45, and I just turned to do one final paper.
and then it went off. My husband was in bed, and all the windows went, and the bathroom was extremely badly damaged.
In your own room?
Yes,
In your room?
yes.
I think that's enough progress.
We were very lucky.
In some ways, I think that almost hardened her resolve. She said that publicly the day of the Brighton bomb when she spoke to the Conservative Party conference, and she followed through on it.
This government will not weaken. This nation will meet that challenge. Democracy will prevail.
The Brighton bomb, I mean, I was amazed. I thought that's the end of these negotiations, frankly. And it's another example of her courage, I think. We had this charming message from the IRA. Something about you can only you may get away with it once or something. Anyway,
you need to be lucky every day.
Yeah, we don't need to be. Yes.
It's very regrettable that other people there were killed or seriously injured. But I felt then, and I said then, that I thought that was an entirely legitimate action, and that's still my position.
The bomb hadn't wrecked the negotiations, but Margaret Thatcher almost brought them down herself. Garret FitzGerald had set up the New Ireland Forum, which had set out 3 options on all-Ireland relationships. Just a month after Brighton, she met with the Taoiseach at Chequers. The meeting appeared to have gone well, until Margaret Thatcher was later questioned at a press conference about the New Ireland Forum's 3 proposals.
And to pursue our shared aim of lasting peace and stability in Northern Ireland.
It was embarrassing because, my role was to be a yes man, that clearly. And I was prepared to be a yes man. I wasn't wanting a quarrel with her. But I wasn't looking for a fight with the Prime Minister at all. But I gave the impression, I think, of being a helpless sort of yes man, which I wasn't either.
That a unified Ireland was one solution that is out. A second solution was a confederation of 2 states. That is out. A third solution was joint authority. That is out. That is a derogation from sovereignty.
It was an outrageous thing to have done. It was typical Thatcher. Public opinion here in the South was incensed.
And I was afraid at the time that the whole process was going to break down.
In an attempt to get the talks back on track, Garret FitzGerald looked to Irish America and President Reagan for help.
Luckily, as it happened, Margaret Thatcher had planned 2 visits to Washington, one in December '84 and one in February '85. And obviously we had briefed both Tip O'Neill's people and President Reagan's people.
For over 10 years, Dublin had tried to win support in America in the hope of putting pressure on London to do something about Northern Ireland. But with Irish-American Tip O'Neill, a leading figure on Capitol Hill, and Ronald Reagan in the White House, they made a breakthrough.
Clearly the relationship between Reagan and O'Neill was an excellent one. And O'Neill used it, in my view, to the full to ensure that Reagan acted on Irish affairs when we needed somebody to act. And O'Neill's own background in Ireland was very deep and was very well informed.
The United States government was under pressure from its own Irish lobby in Washington, and I think Mrs. Thatcher understood that the President and his colleagues needed help in dealing with that.
Documents from the time show that Tip O'Neill wrote to President Reagan, pressing him to raise the breakdown in the talks with Margaret Thatcher.
Reagan under pressure from O'Neill, several times, asked Thatcher to go ahead with the agreement.
Margaret Thatcher had reached the conclusion that Eri Neave's vision of military victory was simply unrealistic.
Because the general view of the army was that this was not a winnable war, that it was possibly possible to hold the field, roughly, to hold the field, but it was not possible to drive the IRA to defeat. Realising that that was their view, sunk into her mind, she became more inclined to negotiate.
For 2 years, Robert Armstrong met with his Dublin counterparts. In the autumn of 1985, the drafting was complete. Her officials were convinced she was ready to sign an historic agreement, but just weeks out from the target date for the Hillsborough summit, Thatcher removed Douglas Hurd as Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, replacing him with former infantry officer Tom King, who was horrified by much of what was being proposed.
He thought it was unfair. I mean, he's a very decent guy, and he just thought it was totally unfair to the Unionists. But he did it, like the soldier that he also was. I mean, there are some advantages to having people who accept the discipline of command.
Tom King was from a different strand in the Tory party, obviously, from Douglas Hurd, and I think was more conscious of the difficulties that could be created for the relationship with the Unionists by the agreement. But it had gone so far by then that there was no going back on it.
Robert Armstrong, along with Douglas Hurd and Geoffrey Howe, helped Thatcher overcome concerns from Tom King and the Northern Ireland office. And on the morning of November the 15th, Margaret Thatcher boarded an RAF helicopter for Hillsborough Castle. But even as she arrived, she was met with a worrying reaction to an agreement she had yet to sign.
The first thing that happened, Margaret Thatcher, the moment she arrived, disappeared upstairs, had to telephone Ian Gow, who was resigning as a minister.
The Conservative MP Ian Gow, who was later murdered by the IRA, was a staunch unionist and one of Margaret Thatcher's closest friends at Westminster.
That those who choose the bullet and the bomb will gain no concessions from Her Majesty's government.
He was particularly close to her. She trusted his judgment, and she was very unhappy that he resigned from the government when she did sign it.
Any change in the status of Northern Ireland would only come about with the consent of a majority of people of Northern Ireland.
It was very obvious that this was something that she was doing, perhaps on the advice of those around her, but it certainly, I think if it was her own volition, I think that it probably wouldn't have been done.
And yet Mrs. Thatcher tells us that that republic must have some say in our province. We say never, 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 never.
All 15 Unionist MPs reacted by resigning their seats and calling people out onto the streets in protest, culminating in a rally at Belfast City Hall, attended by more than 100,000 people.
Our initial reaction was certainly betrayal. Why didn't she discuss this with us? Why didn't we get a hint?
It was an appalling betrayal of the assumptions, which were well-founded, of Unionists, that they could always trust, A, the Tory party, but even more than that, the talisman of the Tory party in terms of unionism, which is Margaret Thatcher. And they were left in the dark. So this was a deliberate policy. I mean, let me speak as an Irish nationalist here. I'm not speaking as a British former official. They would have more polite terms, but I will tell you what the reality was. It was a deliberate, massive betrayal of the Unionists by Margaret Thatcher.
like to indict you, Mrs. Thatcher, as a traitor to the loyalist people of Northern Ireland in denying them their right to vote on the Anglo-Irish Agreement.
Well, it was deliberate because it was felt that if that we couldn't consult the Unionists because there would be no chance of any agreement to what we might consult. So it was an object of the exercise to reach an agreement which didn't depend upon their cooperation.
Almost from the moment of Ian Gow's resignation, Margaret Thatcher regretted the agreement. So why had she signed it in the first place?
I think she had an expectation that signing the agreement would be like waving a magic wand, that the security situation would immediately improve, that the provisionals would be sidelined.
It went against the grain, but she was persuaded that it was the right thing to do and it was going to be helpful in putting an end to IRA terrorism. If you do something which is against the grain, you do tend to regret it afterwards. Half regret it. I mean, half regret it. And, of course, she had the Americans to consider. It helped with the Americans, as she said herself.
My friend, Margaret Thatcher.
Years later, when she was dismissing the agreement and expressing her support even for Enoch Powell's rejection of it, she said to her friends, "It was the Americans who made me do it."
Margaret Thatcher had wanted an agreement that would give her the security solution that Erin Neave had hoped for. She blamed Garret FitzGerald for the failings in the agreement.
Do you think she felt let down by him?
No, I think she felt let down by me and people like me, that we didn't somehow thole the insult and that we took her head on. I think she was more let down by us than by Garret.
If Margaret Thatcher thought the agreement would cut off support from the terrorists and end the violence, she was soon proved wrong. After 1985, the IRA continued to kill, as in Enniskillen in November 1987. But Margaret Thatcher's government was also more ready to use lethal force, as at Loughgall when the SAS killed 8 members of the IRA as they attempted to attack a police station.
Once the British and Irish governments have concluded an agreement, which obviously is sort of sold in America as an initiative of major importance and so on, and that they're in tandem working together on the problem, then that leaves Britain much less exposed to criticism in terms of what it does, and therefore, if you like, gives a somewhat freer hand to its security forces.
After 8 soldiers died in an IRA attack on their bus near Ballygawley in County Tyrone in August 1988, Ken McGuinness was invited to meet Margaret Thatcher, who was seeking information on those behind the attack.
She said, "And thank you very much for coming to see me. Now tell me who did this." So I told her, because I couldn't tell her 100%, but I was able to name names. Subsequently, believe it or not, there was an SAS operation when the same team tried to kill a coal man. And they were ambushed, and that was the end of that particular team.
It looked like the Anglo-Irish Agreement was having no effect on the bigger problem. It began to move again, I think, towards the late 80s, when there were secret channels and people began to realise we must do something here again and try and make progress.
The SAS operations such as Loughgall had a marked impact on Republican morale, which was only added to by international reaction to the Enniskillen attack. During the hunger strikes, Margaret Thatcher had opened up a secret channel to negotiate with the IRA leadership. Up until now, it was thought that she hadn't reopened communications to the IRA until October 1990. But Margaret Thatcher, Secretary of State from 1985 to 1990, has told this programme the British government was exchanging messages with the IRA leadership in the years immediately after the Anglo-Irish Agreement.
Were you aware at that point that actually things were occurring in the undergrowth that could ultimately lead to progress?
Yes, I was.
You were aware?
Yeah.
And can you remember, can you tell us how you were aware and what you were aware of?
I remember one particular phrase that lived on and got embroidered. It was whether there was any strategic or economic interest that could override the democratic wishes of the people of Northern Ireland.
And how did you send that message through?
That, I forget, I mean, it came through, somebody speaking quietly to me and him speaking quietly to somebody else, but it was very much sort of back-channel discussion, but nothing disreputable about that. All the people involved in it, at some considerable personal risk of even, getting involved in any of it, but undoubtedly it's the start of, as I maintain, the Anglo-Irish Agreement, the start of, actually, gradual evolution of what became the peace process.
Do you have any memory of that?
No, none at all. And I would say authoritatively that there was no clarification sought by Republicans. The first engagement face to face between us and the British was Mark McGuinness meeting the British contact in October 1990. So we certainly weren't about seeking clarification.
The first face-to-face meetings may not have happened until 1990, but a senior negotiator from the Irish government says he became aware the British were communicating with the IRA as early as 1986. At this time, Nicholas Scott was Security Minister at Stormont, working closely with the Secretary of State, Tom King. It was Scott who alerted the Irish that London was in contact with the IRA.
He told me on 2 occasions that there were communications with the Provisional IRA. He wouldn't give me any details, he couldn't, but what he said was unmistakably clear. In his view, it was very important to persuade the Provisional IRA to stop the campaign of violence, a proposition that I would agree with. It suited Mrs. Thatcher because her public profile was to be extremely tough, but behind it she was prepared to at least look at the possibility of negotiation. I think that was not to the benefit of the Anglo-Irish Agreement.
It happened, of course, explicitly at the time of the hunger strike. But these contacts don't simply disappear when times get better. They played absolutely no part, I can truthfully say, in the negotiation of the Anglo-Irish Agreement. At no point did I ever see a secret report which had any bearing on what was going on at all. But that's not to say that the people weren't, there was absolutely no contact. I would be surprised if I mean, even in wartime, if you had, contacts with the enemy on the secret channel, you would expect to try to have such contacts.
The effect of that on the provisionals was, of course, to encourage them to be even more intensive in their campaign of violence. In other words, every time this happened, going back to the earliest days of the Troubles, the Provisional IRA took encouragement from the fact that the British were reaching out to them.
Margaret Thatcher didn't survive as Prime Minister to see the outcome of the process she'd begun. By late 1990, her old friends were beginning to desert her.
When every step forward risked being subverted.
It was a combination of the economy going wrong, 11 and a half years of handbagging, a very wearing way of governing, and then Europe, which finally sunk her.
In November 1990, Margaret Thatcher was in Paris for a meeting of world leaders to mark the end of the Cold War. But it also spelt the end of her time in power. She was in a room at the British Embassy when the results of the Conservative Party vote came in from London.
Just going to tell the President.
I got the call first, and she could see my face in the dressing room mirror, and she knew what the outcome was. I thought at that moment it was the end.
Ms. Thatcher, could I ask you to comment?
Good evening. Good evening.
Where's the microphone? It's here. This is the microphone.
She was a few votes short, and I remember how we were watching the television news in the embassy, Hoy turning to us and saying immediately the thing was right, she's gone.
We're leaving Downing Street for the last time, and we're very happy that we leave the United Kingdom in a very, very much better state than when we came here.
She had encouraged her image as an Iron Lady, yet in secret she'd negotiated with the IRA. She believed in the Union, yet she was accused of betraying the Unionists. During her 11 years in office, more than 1,000 people died as a result of the conflict. She had seen 10 prisoners die on hunger strike and signed an agreement she came to resent. But she'd opened up channels to the IRA that just may have begun the process that eventually led to peace.
She never fully understood Ireland, North or South. If anything, she was more puzzled by the Unionists than she was of the Nationalists. She expected more of them. But she never, in my view, came to the understanding of Irish affairs.
He was one of these people, a lot of the time you think, gosh, she's awful. I was very put off by her in some ways. But you can't not admire her.
She probably did what she thought was right, and none of us are one-dimensional, so I'm sure she wasn't one-dimensional. But she was in the job, and she could have done it differently.
She would have welcomed peace in Northern Ireland. Of course, it was better than war, but she was never quite comfortable with the price that was paid for it.
Do you think either of you actually understood the Irish any more in 1990 than you did in 1979?
Oh, probably not. No, I don't make any claims about that. But they sure didn't understand us.